And I welcome via video conference the Chief Executive Officer of the National Disability Insurance Agency, Ms Rebecca Falkingham, PSM. Ms Falkingham, do you wish to make an opening statement?
No, I don't. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Before I call officers from the NDIA, I remind the committee that the purpose of today's hearing is to ask questions in relation to the examination of the NDIA with respect to the Annual Financial Sustainability Report, Q1 and annual reports as advised by senators. And I would appreciate if the scope of questions can please remain within these topics. I now invite questions from senators. I'll just check who I've got online. I think it's Senator Hughes
is online.
From the Secretariat, perhaps could answer. No one from the Greens Party? Okay.
Yes, Penny's there. Oh. I can see Penny.
Senator Allman-Payne, I'll just check that we have you.
Yep, I'm here, Chair.
Okay, great. Welcome.
And I'm happy to Linda take the lead.
So I would normally go to the Deputy Chair first, but it's up to you, Penny, if you want me to come to the room first with Senator Reynolds, or if you'd like to take the call.
Chair, I actually only have questions for Services Australia, so I'm very happy to pass over to the others.
All right, thank you. So, Senator Reynolds, I'll start the call with you. I understand Senator Urquhart has questions as well, so I'll seek to rotate the call at about 15, but I'll give you a nudge if you require it. So, Senator Reynolds, you have the call.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can we get the NDIA back up on the screen?
It'll come when they speak. Yep.
Are they still there?
We are here.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Look, thank you very much for appearing here. I note that the AFSR, which was the subject of today, was only released this morning, all 218 pages of it. Could you, given the report was to the 30th of June, can you advise when the AFSR, the first draft, was prepared and when it went up to the Minister's office, the first version of it went up to the Minister's office, and to start off with that?
Senator, I'm happy to take that on notice. Obviously, it went to the board several times, to the working group of the board several times before it went to the Minister, but happy to get the dates for you.
So if you could get the dates when it was first drafted, when it also went to the government actuary. Obviously it went to him some time ago because it was reported on in the annual report. So if I could get that date, the date that it went to and from the Minister's office, and the date it went to and from the board, and then when the final version went to states and territories, please.
Happy to get you those dates, Senator.
Okay, thank you. Given that you've provided only a couple of hours for us to review the document, I am going to need Mr Gifford to go through the relevant pages and assumptions and point us to those. Is there any reason, actually, before I do, is there any reason it was only uploaded this morning, given this was 216 pages for us to digest for this session?
No, Senator, it's been released at the earliest available opportunity. So, but Mr Gifford is here to be able to answer any questions you have.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so having a look, I want to go to the first cost driver, Mr Gifford, and that is participant numbers. So, as I understand it from the AFSR, participant numbers at the end of June, because this is obviously now very dated, was 661,267, and in the Q1 report that was released before this, numbers had gone to 680,123. Is that correct, or have I?
That's good. Sorry, Senator, I'm just getting the state Gifford, scheme actuary, but yes, the 680,123, correct.
Okay, so July, August, so that's the end of September. Do you know what the current number is?
So, Senator, I can, as at the end of October, in the summary of statistics that was published in mid-November, it was 683,712.
And where does that sit with the most recent projections?
So I'd have to take a precise figure on notice, Senator, but it's slightly above the latest projection. I think by it's somewhere between 0 and 1% above that projection. Okay.
So can you just explain for those people who are not familiar with the different projections and the baselines, as I can see here, you're still running, we've got two different baselines. We've got, the June 2023 baseline, and you've now got this new AFSR data. So are you referring to the June 2023 baseline, that it's gone up somewhere up to 1% above projections?
So the reference I just made, Senator, was to the projections contained in this report, so what we would refer to as the June 2024 projections.
Okay, so where does that sit in relation to the previous projections that were used as the baseline in last financial year's AFSR?
Look, I'd have to take the precise figure on notice, Senator, but the projected number of participants from June 2023 was higher. So the latest number of participants we've got, I think, would almost certainly be below that previous projection.
Rather than having to take it on notice, that would be in section 5. So do you want to go to section 5 to refresh your memory, and you can walk us through that?
Certainly.
So we've got section 5, correct? So on this, it's page 71.
Yeah, that's correct. So page 71. Sorry, page 71. So page 71 is the projection from within this AFSR, the June 2024 projection that the actual number at June 2024 was the 661,267 that you referred to earlier.
Yes.
And then the projection at the end of the financial year, 721,584. This table doesn't break down the monthly projections, but as I said, the number as at the end of October was slightly, I could give you the precise figure on notice, but slightly above the projected figure at the end of October.
Okay, which means that it's over projection. So this is just for the first driver of cost. It's over projection, significantly over projection, which is sort of up to 1%, which in the terms of these numbers, it's actually, in the thousands. But so in relation to the June 2024 that were based for last year's budget, it would then be well over 1% over that baseline number, which formed the basis of the forward estimate numbers in the budget, correct? So that was what was used for last year's budget. So this would probably be, rough calculation, 2% over last year's budget, baseline numbers.
So, Senator, as I said, I'd need to take the projection of participant numbers from the previous AFSR, if that's what you're referring to. Yes. Sorry, I do have that figure actually is in the report on page 78, if you wish to take a look at that. And the projected number of participants at June 2024 from the previous report, it's in the chart on page 78, 668,907. So you can see that that's about 7,500 higher than the number we actually had at the end of this, as at June 2024. So the number that we actually have at the end of October, I'm pretty confident in saying would be below the number from last year's AFSR.
But you'll take that on notice?
I'll take the precise figure on notice, correct.
Thank you, because had we had an extra day, I could have actually gone through and checked the figures from the last one. However, if you can provide that on notice. So the next question is, so the report says that this growth is annualised, is now, so it's on 12.1% growth in participant numbers. Is that correct?
You might just have to point me to that specific reference, Senator. The total projected growth in participant numbers in on page 71 that you just referred to. The total growth in participants over the 24-25 financial year is from 661,000 to 721,000. I think that's a little bit, just off the top of my head, that's about 9% annually. So the 12.1 you referred to, you might just need to point.
But this report, the latest one released, is the older of the Q1 report. The Q1 report, which we've had time to read, which is your own report as well, Mr Gifford, says it's round about, I understand, 12%.
Sorry, I think you...
So for Q1...
If you could just let him answer.
Because he's not...
It's very difficult with the delay, the captions and
not being
the
here.
video, so like many senators aren't. Mr Gifford, if you want to answer.
Sorry, Senator. I think I'm guessing that you're referring to the figure in the quarterly report, which refers to the 2.9% for the quarter.
That's correct.
And I'm imagining that figure on an annualised basis is 12.1%.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So, okay. So at the moment, with the latest data you've got, which is reinforced by the October figures, is that it is increasing somewhere around 12%, give or take a little bit.
Yeah, look. As I said, I mean, it's the actual number of participants at the end of October was less than 1% more than what was projected. I'll take the precise figure on notice.
So, but it's over. So basically, for anybody listening, the projections is over your revised base. So you're over projection what was actually in the budget.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just make one additional comment, Senator, that obviously, you know, as we've discussed previously in estimates, I mean, there is a bit of month-to-month volatility in various, you know, metrics. I think with the number of new participants, there was
we'll come to them.
Probably a small. Well, sorry. So the total number of participants, but there was probably a small. It's reasonable to surmise there was a small catch-up in the number of new participants who came into the scheme in that September quarter, and the number, as I said, the growth in number of participants in the month of October was only a little over 3,000. So that was actually a little bit lower, or quite a bit lower actually, than we observed in the first 3 months of the financial year. So there was quite a bit of volatility from those first 3 months to that fourth month.
Which is why also we don't just look at 1 quarter annualised. You actually go back and compare it to the same quarter the previous year to see the trends. And again, on that one, it is still up. But I'll get that number from the 2022-23 report.
Sure.
Mr Gifford, can we please go to table 5.6 on page 74?
Yeah.
Now, this table was referred to by the government actuary in his report, and on page 1, he lists 6 supporting documents that he was provided to make his assessment. Are you able? I don't expect you to have them there with you, but can you please provide them on notice?
I mean, I'll just need to confirm that whether they were. I can't. We'll certainly provide on notice what we're able to, Senator. Absolutely.
Yes. And I can see no reason. There were things like an Excel spreadsheet, and he actually lists them all. So if you could take on notice to provide all of those documents, and if not, if you make a public interest immunity claim.
We'll take it on notice, Senator. Obviously, it goes to the level of data in relation to that's in the spreadsheet, but we're always very happy to take on notice and be very transparent about why we can't provide something.
Yeah, so, sorry, Senator. I do just note that at least, you know, there's at least one of those documents is a set of draft results, and I think we just need to take on consideration, you know, the appropriateness of providing draft results. But we'll certainly, as I said, we'll take on notice what we possibly can provide.
Mr Gifford, if that's the case, that is so. If that draft information was what was provided to the government actuary, and he has made his findings based on that draft information. Can you please advise us then whether there were any changes to that draft information, and if that revised information was actually provided to the actuary, because it may well he would have needed to have changed his assessment if the data had changed.
Yeah, look, we'll take it on notice, Senator, absolutely.
Thank you.
We're due to rotate in a couple of minutes, Senator.
Thank you. I'll just finish off this bracket. We've got plenty more. So the June 2024 projections are $484 million above the June 2023 projections and $489 million higher than the 24-25 budget projections. So, one, can you confirm that's correct?
So you're just referring to the projection for the 24-25 financial year,
Yes.
Senator?
Yes.
That's, yeah.
Okay. So what are the implications then if you are consistently hundreds of millions above the projections that formed the basis of the last budget that flow into this budget? What are the implications? Oh, sorry, Minister, are we a bit tired?
You just keep asking
Thank
the questions, Senator.
You seem a bit... So can you just explain the implications of that then if the scheme is still consistently running over budget and over projected numbers of participants?
Well, Senator, I guess I would comment that whilst the number of participants at the end of October is slightly above the projection from June, and as I said, that's, you know, there's probably a little bit to do with a bit of clearing up of participant numbers who were in the system as at June. The total expenditure at the end of September, as reported in the quarterly report, was under projection. So, look, whilst obviously we keep a very close eye on the number of participants and want to understand why that is, the headline metric that we do look at when we're understanding the sustainability of the scheme's total expenditure, which was below projection at the end of September. So, you know, so I guess I would, yeah, that would be my answer.
All right. Due to rotate,
not actually an answer,
Senator
but thank you.
Urquhart is on the line. Senator, you've got the call.
Right, thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Can you tell me, with the 2023-2024 AFSR released, can you give me a rundown on the latest growth rate? What does it actually mean for participants? Can you step me through and talk me about what's driving this positive change, and how do the NDIS reforms and the Bill number 1 impact these changes?
Thanks, Senator. Rebecca Faulkner, CEO of the agency. I'll start off and then our scheme actuary can add to it, because as you know, these results are really pleasing for the future financial sustainability of the scheme and for participants, and they've come from a lot of significant hard work right across the agency. So the reforms to the NDIS, which were announced now almost 2 years ago by the government, have put the scheme on the road to financial sustainability, with the impact of that recent legislative changes and other reforms projected to reduce NDIS growth by more than $19 billion over the next 4 years. While the NDIS continues to grow and we remain an uncapped scheme, results show that we are improving the scheme's financial sustainability to not only deliver a much fairer and more consistent scheme for participants, but to ensure it remains one for future generations to come. The annual financial sustainability report really pleasingly shows that the predicted scheme expenses to be $46.9 billion for the 2024-25 financial year. And the AUSPar projects the NDIS growth rate to reduce from 12% in 2024-25 to 8.4% in 25-26, following the implementation of the government's reforms to make the NDIS much stronger and continuing on our pathway of putting participants at the centre. From 26-27, the annual growth in the scheme will be within the 8% target that the government has set for the financial sustainability framework. I just want to do a shout out to our extraordinary staff in the agency who day in, day out continue to put participants at the centre of everything we do while ensuring the scheme will be around. Over the 4-year forward estimates period to June 2028, the projected scheme expenses are $2.3 billion lower than the previous AFSR projections in June 2023 and $1 billion lower for the same 4-year period in 24-25. These really build on those green shoots that we've discussed with this committee previously, with the latest data showing the scheme expenses for the 12 months to the 30th of June considerably improved to be around $600 million less than 24-25. A continuing trend, really pleasing trend, and a massive shout out to Scott McNaughton, our Deputy CEO, and his team around stabilising plan inflation, but ensuring we're managing participant risks. Plan inflation was at 10.1% and remains below the level observed between July 2022 and December 2023. And most people leaving the scheme as their NDIA supports needs stabilise. It's really pleasing to see the success of the scheme is giving people the supports to live their best lives and not needing ongoing support from the scheme. But also always having that opportunity to stay engaged with the NDIA if their circumstances change and they need those supports again. So there's some really excellent green shoots in the AFSR, and I'll just see if my colleague Mr. Gifford wants to add to that.
Yeah, one additional comment I might make, Senator, is that within the growth rates that Ms Falkingham quoted, I would note that from a participant point of view, there is still allowance for cost per participant to grow by approximately 3 to 4% in real terms. So I guess what that does represent is that participants' plans will grow where there's reasonable circumstances for them to do so. So the total growth targets that have been set to include that allowance. But look, apart from that, I think Ms Falkham's done a really good summary of the AFSR.
Yeah, fantastic. It's really, really great to hear. I'm just wondering, can you tell me about the improvements in participant outcomes that are outlined in the latest quarterly report? I mean, you've given us a really good snapshot of how the actual fiscal position's improving, but can you talk to me about the improvement in the participants' outcomes?
Yep. Yes, thanks, Senator. So look, there's a number of outcomes in the quarterly report that are highlighted. I'll just go to sort of a few of the key ones. That the participants who aged 15 years or older who've been in the scheme for 2 years or more, there's over 20% improvement in the proportion of participants reporting improved participation in social and community activities. Participation in work for participants aged 15 to 24 has more than doubled from baseline, in other words, from when they entered the scheme. Participants in the scheme for 2 years or more, there's an increase of 6% in the proportion of their families and carers who are reporting being in paid employment. And finally, of more than 3/4 of participants aged 15 years or older who have been in the scheme for more than 2 years report that the scheme has helped them to have greater choice and control in their lives. So, as I said, look, there's a lot of, as I think you're probably well aware, we gather a lot of detail about these outcomes. They're probably a few of the key highlights that we call out.
Yeah, that's really, really fantastic because it's really what the scheme was meant to do. Can you also touch on some of the financial numbers in the annual report? And if you could unpack for me what some of the drivers of the improved performance are, what actually has made that occur?
So, Senator, sorry, you're referring to the annual report or the quarterly report? Yep.
No, the annual report,
Yeah. So I think that maybe the key result in the annual report in relation to the financial performance is that, Ms Falkingham's just given a summary of the latest scheme projections that were contained in a summary of which is contained in the annual report. Probably the other critical or the other significant financial outcome reported in the annual report is that scheme expenditure for the 23-24 financial year was approximately $600 million below the estimate that was contained in the 24-25 budget. So that was that's probably a little over it's a little over 1% below the figure that was contained in the 24-25 budget. The other probably key statistic, and I might just need to take the exact figure on notice, but that the trend of increasing plan inflation that had been seeing for probably a couple of years certainly showed some stabilisation in the 6 months to June. So I can probably take the precise figure regarding that on notice.
That'd be great, because my next question was around the plans that you've got for inflation, and particularly what do you expect to happen with some of the latest reforms being implemented, particularly those ones for plan inflation.
Thanks, Senator. We might ask our Deputy CEO, Scott McNaught, who's been leading a lot of the work on plan inflation with participants at the centre, to respond to this one.
Thank you. Scott McNaught, Deputy CEO of Service Delivery. Thanks. We've been doing a lot of work on improving the capability of the frontline service delivery network over the last 12 to 18 months. As you'll be aware, we got a good boost to our funding in the 23-24 budget initiative, and that's allowed us to build out our frontline capability, as well as to invest into some more of our specialist pathways. So we've got more dedicated planners in areas such as home and living, and in our specialist teams, in our complex areas, our hospital discharge teams, and our justice teams. So there's a lot more work to support people who need that more higher level intervention. We're also doing a lot of work. One of the reforms was to have a focus on looking at more contemporary models to home and living decisions rather than supported independent living as a default. So we have a dedicated team of people helping participants explore more contemporary options rather than to sort of defaulting to more supported independent living settings in all cases. So that's proved a really good outcome for participants as well as for sustainability. And we'll just give me,
Maria, just on that point, can you just give me a really quick example of what you mean by that contemporary sort of option?
Yeah, sure, Senator. So traditionally what used to happen is someone would apply essentially for a supported independent living package of supports. And if they met that threshold, they would usually get that. I checked the number with the actuary, but the average plan for someone in supported independent living is probably around $440,000 a year, so that they're quite, there's a lot of supports put into those plans. But what we started to hear from participants is, are there more modern ways of doing it? Could I rent with my friends and get drop-in supports or some assistance with daily living and live in my own accommodation? I want to live with a couple of mates and do what we call an innovative living option support. So there are different ways, and sometimes we fund people just to explore different models rather than having to go and default to a supported independent living. So we help people explore more contemporary options, and we've had some really good stories through that as well.
That's great. Fantastic. Can you tell me, I mean, that's obviously one of the areas that you're working on to improve participant outcomes. Are there any other areas that you really want to highlight that you think are that the NDIA is now currently working on that will improve outcomes for participants?
Yeah, thanks, Senator. We're continuing to work on areas such as how we can support people to build their independence and capability. As Mr. Gifford mentioned, one of our areas of focus is transition from school to work. So we can see people entering the workforce where they can and supporting people to get a job. So that's a really important area as part of those life event-based planning decisions that we're trying to do. We're also doing more and more work for people who might be in specialist areas, as I mentioned, in our justice settings or in our complex support needs pathway. I'm still doing a lot of work with young people in residential aged care to see if there's better alternate ways that they could reside in more contemporary living arrangements. So a lot of work with the planning team about what are those key life events to help people transition to those, whether it's school to work, whether that's children in the early intervention pathways graduating into the school systems, getting people ready for school leaver employment programs. There are other things that we're investing in, helping people move from education into the workforce. So those key areas of focus will continue for us, Senator.
Yeah, and that improvement in people moving into work, whether it's out of school or, you know, just moving into work, what have been the key drivers around that, do you think?
There's a lot of work that we've been doing as part of our employment strategy, also working with the disability employment sector and other sectors around the crossover between those. But one of the early learnings for us is starting that journey early. So person on the scheme who's going through secondary school, working through, there's a funded program, we call it School Leaver Employment Services, or SLES internally. Excuse me. So how do we fund that and support a person to think through those really important life transitions at that stage?
I think just to add to that, Senator, that obviously as part of our refresh strategy now, that as Mr McNaughton says, that real focus on speaking to kids before they're at that point of leaving school is so critical to what we're driving in terms of better employment outcomes. We're also delivering information sessions on NDIS employment to providers and to support coordinators and local area coordinators, making sure that they make those connections at a local level as well, so that participants know what opportunities they are. And I think that's been really warmly received at the moment, of us kind of taking a much more proactive approach locally, working with local service providers to kind of make sure that that array of employment opportunities are there for participants, and that we can then wrap around and make sure that the right supports are there for success.
So is that part of the work that the local area coordinators are doing? Is that sort of working with employers, and are you finding that more employers are sort of more receptive to, you know, employing someone with a disability?
I would hope so, Senator, but I think we've got a long way to go, and particularly post the Disability Royal Commission, we as an agency obviously want to be an employer of choice for people with disability. We have a long way to go as well, making sure that we're making the connections, particularly given the footprint across the country, so that we can, you know, point out to people where we think there are further opportunities for disability employment, talking to our colleagues right across the Commonwealth every opportunity we get to really kind of promote all the great outcomes that come from ensuring that people with disability are getting those employment opportunities. We've taken great strides. I think you know that, you know, even in our National Contact Centre, you know, we set ourselves a target for disability employment that we've met. We want to go above and beyond, so that in all those conversations we're having with employers, we can kind of lead by example and actually show how much work there is to be done. But our local area coordinators provide a really good connection, and obviously as part of the work towards navigation that the NDIS review kind of indicated we should move towards, we've had lots of conversations in the agency about making sure employment is critical to that, even thinking about, like, what does an employment pathway broker look like under a navigation model. So we're really excited by that opportunity over the next 2 years.
Senator, I'm due to rotate now, but I can come back to you if needed. Senator Reynolds, you've got the call.
Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Mr Gifford, could we come back to, so the two drivers of cost, we've got in the last quarterly report an annualised increase of around about 12% in participant numbers, and I've just gone back and had a look at this Q1 versus last Q1, and it's about on par, so it is about still trending 3% for the first quarter. So say it's 12 or just under. Now, if we can go to the second driver of costs, and I'm not sure what page in the quarterly report, I haven't got it open here, but I understand that as of September, the average payments have increased by just under 8% per annum, taking it up to $65,200 per person per year. Is that correct?
That sounds familiar, Senator. I think, yeah, it's consistent with the figure that was published by the end
Okay.
Now,
if we could go to the AFSR report, so thank you for that. So if we can have a look at the split of your numbers. So this is table 5.2, and we'll just run through Chapter 5 reports, page 72 of the AFSR. So in terms of projections for participant numbers, We've got currently the number you've quoted, 661,267, which is now more than that, as you've noted. And then you're projecting by 2034. So you've got it split between existing scheme participants, so those people who are on the scheme today who will still be on the scheme in 10 years' time. So that's reduced by nearly 150,000 people, round about 90, just over 90,000 people you've got coming off the scheme in the next, or over the forward estimates. Is that about right? It's table 5.2.
It looks closer to 80,000, Senator, but give or take, sure.
Okay. Sorry, my maths is not great. I'm just doing this on the fly. So 80,000 over the forward estimates. And then you've got 150,000 people coming off the scheme who are existing on the scheme today. Is that about right? Maybe just under 140, 150.
Approximately.
I think it's really important to contextualise those numbers, Senator. So we're not suggesting...
I want to ask this question.
Sorry, Ms Fulkingham. Senator Reynolds, the agency is able to finish an answer to a question as they see fit.
I do want to come to that, Ms Fulkingham.
The call will come back to you, Senator Reynolds. So, Ms Fulkingham, you can finish your answer, and then Senator Reynolds, you can ask a question. Ms Fulkingham.
It's going to take a lot of time.
Thanks, Chair. As everyone would be aware, at National Cabinet in December 2023, there was a really historic decision kind of taken in relation to the need for foundational support. So that's putting in place the scaffolding that the scheme always envisaged around having targeted and general supports, and our colleagues in DSS can speak about that more. But I think it's important when we're talking about these numbers to make it clear that those people will continue with supports through the foundational supports program that is currently being discussed between the Commonwealth and the states and territories.
Thank you very much for that clarification, Ms Fulkingham. I appreciate that. But I've just got a series of questions that relate to this. So for time, if I could just ask for the numbers to start with, because this is what this is about. So we've got over the forward, so in table 5.2, we've got the 80,000 plus coming off over the forward estimate, so over the next 4 years. We've got 140 to 150 coming off the scheme over 10 years. And then we come into table 5.3, which has a curious symmetry to it, that by 2034, 50% of participants will be existing scheme participants and 50% will be future participants. Now, that is actually quite significant. When you come, I think, and this is what I want to unpack, if you could unpack, Mr Gifford, on page 73, there's a note that says that by that time, 33-34, 68% of projected expenses will relate to existing scheme participants, which are those who are currently on the scheme, that 50%, but only 32% will relate to new entrants, which is another 50%. So can you please give us a quick summary of why that is, and then if you've got more detailed data, if you can put that on notice?
Sure, Senator. So the short answer is that on average, existing participants are more expensive than new entrants to the scheme. The sort of simplest way to explain that is that, people, there were many people who transitioned into the scheme with high needs when the scheme's established. Many of those, not all of those, but many of those are SIL participants receiving high levels of supports. Whilst we do get we do get new SIL participants year by year, the number of those new participants who receive high levels of support is lower relative to existing numbers. And a larger proportion of new participants entering the scheme tend to be children who have lower annual expenditure. So, yeah, it's really a simple matter of the mix of existing participants and their needs as opposed to the mix of new participants.
Could you please take on... So it's hard to actually have a look at this further without the assumptions that underpin that. So could you take on notice the assumptions that have underpinned that? Because that actually sounds counterintuitive to what's actually happening with the scheme. And as Ms Fulkingham has just said, a large number of participants with lower needs are supposed to be coming off the scheme to go into other foundational supports. So that does actually, on the face of it, seem counterintuitive that the next lot, the 500,000 people coming into the scheme, will on average be far lower support requirements than those currently on the scheme, when you're actually, by your own, by the government's own commentary, currently removing, and we'll come to the numbers of people, the 140-odd thousand people that Ms Falkingham said will come off the scheme. They're not high support needs. So can you just explain that a bit further, because it does appear very counterintuitive?
Well, the people leaving the scheme, Senator, are, a mix of obviously children who, sort of came into the scheme under early intervention and achieve outcomes and leave the scheme. But there is also a proportion of the people who leave the scheme who become deceased. That's one of the assumptions that we make in the projection that is documented. But I think just to your point about the counterintuitive nature, I will just, again, even acknowledging the point that Ms Falkingham made, that the foundational supports are intended to obviously, provide support to those people who won't need the scheme. The mix of new people entering the scheme on average still have lower needs than those in the scheme. As I said, when the scheme was established, there was a large number of people right across Australia who had quite high needs, and the scheme's obviously now supporting those, and the number of new people with relatively high needs, let's say, who might, as Mr McNaughton said before, who might have plans of $400,000 or more, is relatively low. So, look, we can probably take on notice to provide the numbers and explain that.
Could you please take that on notice, and specifically, if you can provide, a snapshot or point us not just to the website, we've been around that buoy with somebody else, but actually provide where we can actually find the data, so we can have a look at, who of that 140-odd thousand who will be exiting, who you're assuming will exit the scheme over the next 3.5 years, I think it is now, having a look at that. So of that 140,000, what is your actuarial assumptions on what percentage of that will die and will transition out of the scheme because of death? From memory, that's not a large percentage, but it is valid. How many kids who have aged out of the early intervention scheme, in your assumptions, will form part of that 140+ thousand? And then who are the others that will be exiting out of that scheme? So then if you can put the projections that you've based those 10-year assumptions on, which is a dramatically less than 40%, so roughly 60-40% of the expenditure. So on what are your assumptions then in 2032, 33, I think it is, 33, 34, why do you think that they're going to be, on whole, much less, have fewer requirements than those people that you've currently got in the scheme? Because you are getting rid of people with lower requirements. And I'm not arguing the need for that, I'm just saying it as a term of actuarial assumptions.
We can provide that on notice, Senator, and also the category of people we assume transition into aged care as well.
Yep. So just on that point, and perhaps if you could provide further clarification, because from recollection, the past financial sustainability reports have also assumed the aspects of schemes would moderate over the medium to long term, but that certainly has never happened so far. But now you're actually using those assumptions that it's actually going to moderate even further than had been previously predicted, and we've got no evidence of that occurring yet. So if you could just explain the actuarial underpinnings of that assumption.
I'm not sure it's true to say, Senator, excuse me, that there isn't data which actually shows the green shoots to which we are speaking about, but very happy to take it on notice. But in terms of what I discussed earlier, in terms of planned inflation, we are most definitely seeing moderation. So very happy to take it on notice, but I wouldn't want it to be left. There is not data that actually shows scheme moderation.
Look, thank you, Ms Falkenham, I appreciate that. But we've just ascertained that participant numbers are still up around 12% and will be nearly doubling over the next 10 years, up to over 1 million participants. We've also got that average payments per person on that increased number is still going up above projections, and it's not at all clear how what is currently in the budget, because every budget under the previous government in recent years and also this current government, projections have never been met and tens of billions of dollars have actually needed to be spent. And having a look at these figures here, I don't doubt that you're seeing some green shoots, but what I'm looking at is what is the data to underpin the very optimistic numbers in the budget that are reflected in the AFSR.
Sure, I think it is clear, but we'll provide you information on notice that explains it.
Thank you. Now, can I then unpack this a little bit further? So, in the Q1 report, so I just wanted to pick up the issue you raised of mortality rates. So in the Q1 report, it said the number of people leaving the NDIS for non-mortality reasons has increased and is continuing to increase. Do you have a mortality number there or a percentage? Well, you would have an actual number and also a percentage of those leaving.
I don't have in front of me, Senator, the number who left the scheme due to mortality reasons in the quarter. I mean, I can refer you to there's a chart in the AFSR that shows the estimated number of people leaving the scheme for mortality reasons, which is on page 85 of the report.
Thank you. Let's go to that.
0.8% per annum.
Okay, so projected mortality rates has been sitting at round about 1% or just over through until this financial year, correct? Just a little bit?
Yeah, a little bit, but a bit lower this financial year.
Yeah. And
a comment I would make is as the proportion of people in the scheme who are children does continue to increase, obviously we would expect that mortality rate to reduce.
Yep, but you will provide me the actual breakdown of the actual numbers of mortality rates. So say over the period of this figure, 5.9, the actuals and the projections, and also what percentage of mortalities comprise the forward estimates, the 90-odd thousand plus 140-odd thousand numbers that you have got in that table 5.2. So is that clear?
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yes, I think we can. That's clear enough. We can take that on notice for sure.
Okay. Now I want to come to the Australian Government Actuaries full report, which is very similar. That is very similar to the one that he did in the annual report. Now he recommends that all aspects of projections where experience is expected to change and is expected to be monitored and then reflected in updates. Can you just explain briefly, and then I'll notice with more detail, how you're actually doing that?
So I think, your question is how are we monitoring scheme experience and then reflecting those in updates?
Yes.
Yeah. So look, we review the key drivers of scheme experience on a regular basis. There's certainly discussions and sort of review of those drivers within the, by management of the agency to understand those drivers. And so then when as sort of required under the NDIS Act, periodically, scheme expenditure, projections of scheme expenditure are updated that reflects those updated experience. Obviously, on an annual basis, those updated projections are communicated via the annual financial sustainability report, and including in the annual report. So there's a sort of I guess what we would refer to as the it's a sort of, there's a term that's used within the actuarial profession, which is a control cycle, where there's it's a sort of a continuous process of understanding what's being observed, understanding how that relates to what was assumed to happen, and then refining the projections on the basis of those comparisons. And as I said, that's a process that obviously involves myself and my team who sort of undertake that analysis, but it certainly involves a lot of input from agency management, because that's where there's a lot of understanding of what those drivers are.
So Mr. Gifford, thank you for that, and I appreciate so the bottom line is, if I could summarise what you've said, is that you keep very tight control of it, you report it monthly, and then you update assessments so the board and the management executive are familiar with whether you're on track or not.
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. Yeah.
Thank you. So can we come then to table 5.7, which is on page 76. And it's very clear in the AFSR and also in the Government Actuaries report that there is still a great deal of uncertainty. So he has made the observation that if all of these things the government has promised to occur, and if all of the reforms that the state governments are supposed to do, then these figures will be realised. Is that's a layman's, not an actuarial, but is that true, that there are still, this is assessment-based, largely on your judgment as a professional actuary, and also he's very clear that these numbers will only be delivered if all of the reforms are implemented on time and on schedule, and they still then get the desired outcome. Is that a safe assessment?
There's a set of assumptions in relation to the impact of the recent and proposed reforms. Obviously, myself and agency management will track very closely how scheme performance is tracking versus what's expected from those reforms, and like any organisation, I guess then there's an opportunity to respond if things don't emerge as expected. As I touched on, as of the end of October, the performance is tracking in line or slightly below what's projected. But yeah, it's an ongoing process of.
So, can I ask one more question on this?
I'm likely going to extend your call for 15. I'm just going to just clarify who's online. So, Senator Reynolds, I would normally be due to rotate the call. I think I've got another block from Senator Pratt. I just want to check if Senator Steele-John is on the line, because the Greens requested this spillover as well.
He was going to be.
He's not. Okay. Well, in the absence of the Greens, what I suggest is I'll extend your call for another 15 minutes and I'll pass to Senator Pratt, and then if we don't have Senator Steele-John here, we'll come back to the opposition, so Senator Reynolds.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. So at the bottom of table 5.7, it again makes that clear. Actual experience and assumptions change made since the budget projections before recent and proposed reforms reduced the budget baseline. Now, could you advise, are you able to now provide detail of what specifically those reforms are and your assumptions that underpin each one of those reforms, and how each one of those reforms has impacted the budget bottom line? So that's the ones that are in the federal government's control. And secondly, if the foundational supports, which have obviously been factored into the budget, if you could advise how those foundational supports, none of the states and territories have signed up to them yet and have certainly not allocated any money. So when did your assumptions start to kick in terms of the savings that will be realised from these reforms that are clearly noted as a risk?
We can take that on notice for you, Senator, but I guess I would say for the first time in the scheme's history, through the passage of the legislation, through the work that we're doing on the new support needs assessment, on the new budget tool. We've never had greater tools and levers in the agency in relation to being able to manage and deliver on these assumptions, but very happy to give you a granular breakdown of how we get to those points.
Yeah. So look, I appreciate that, Ms Falkingham, because that is actually the subject of this spillover estimates, is actually to understand, because we're talking about projection over $200 billion expenditure on this scheme. So actually understanding the assumptions that underpin, realising that, because at the moment these reforms have not been implemented, and certainly the foundational reforms, where 140 odd, or minus people who are deceased, coming off, at the moment there is no one to support them either. So and as you know, we've been around this many times, what is now the granular detail of these reforms, and how are they being inputted and factored into the budget in terms of your appropriations, and what year do each of those kick in and to what percentage? And particularly in relation to well, maybe just a quick question, then not on notice, that I'm sure Mr Gifford has to hand, but in what year are you starting to bank savings in your budget for foundational supports as people come off the scheme?
Senator, so I suppose your original question did relate to the reforms in their entirety, which is, sorry,
yes.
Did you want me to speak to those?
Sorry, so in context, we've gone around this question many times in terms of the last 3 budgets at least, in terms of trying to look for clarity about, in the budget papers it talks about the sustainability framework, which we haven't got any information on yet, 2.5 years later. But now specifically, what are the individual reforms that have been implemented or at least budgeted for in this document? And the actuary talks about, the government actuary talks about it, these reports talk about it, the AFSR does. So what are the specific reforms? The ones that the federal government is responsible for implementing, and what are the savings associated over the forward estimates and then out to 10 years? And then what are the reforms and then the savings that have been already made over the 10 years for foundational supports and for what these states and territories are supposed to pick up?
I would say, Senator, we've gone through in a lot of detail with the committee the government's investment starting 2 years ago in relation to the reform for outcomes. So that has gone through. We've gone through with the committee the investment in the workforce, the changes around supported independent living. We've gone through the approach in relation to home and living more generally. We've gone through the work on some of the investment in specialised services within the agency. Obviously, the legislation was passed by the Parliament. We've had an NDIS review that sets out very clearly the architecture for the future sustainability of the scheme. So I'll pass to Mr Gifford, but we have gone through in a lot of detail over the last 2 years the specifics about the reforms and how they align with the AFSR.
I appreciate that, Ms Falkingham, and yes, we have talked in generalities. And we've had a lot of government sort of very high-level releases, but what we haven't had, and that's what I'm now asking for, is Mr Gifford's assumptions and data that has gone into. So it's not just saying we have made staff changes, it's what are the assumptions that these staff changes, what is the linkage between that reform and specific dollars in the budget, or fewer dollars in the budget, and including the foundational. So maybe I'll ask it a different way. I mean, I know we understand each other, because we've been around this before, but maybe can I ask, has any modelling been done surrounding the implementation of the foundational supports? Any financial modelling that's inputted into the budget at all? Or to your AFSR figures?
Yeah, Senator. So I mean, the report does refer to the fact that there is an allowance made in
A second, there you are. Thank you. We just had a brief blip in connectivity. We've got you back.
Yes, Senator. So,
sorry, Senator, just to let you know that your room's frozen on our end.
We can still hear you if you can hear us.
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I mean, there is a reference just in the report, it's page 78, if that helps, just around, there is an allowance for fewer new entrants to enter the scheme, resulting from foundational supports, as Falkman referred to earlier. The first year that is expected to take place is the 2026-27 financial year. Noting, so that's it's an allowance for a reduced number of people entering the scheme in that year.
How many, Mr. Gifford? Is that the whole? So by 26-27, what? That's the 90-odd thousand.
So the 90-odd thousand that you're referring to, Senator, which is the reduction in the number of existing participants. There's no assumption in relation to existing participants transitioning to foundational supports. I mean, noting that the sort of exact policy settings are yet to be determined.
Okay, but that's also not quite. Can you just explain how that then coincides with Table 5.2, where we've got between this year and over the next decade, the scheme will actually increase by 500,000 participants.
Yep.
So it's actually exponentially increasing. So for next financial year, you've got 78,000 going up to 236,000 in 28.
Yeah, so like I said, so the top row, the existing scheme participants row in Table 5.2 just reflects people leaving the scheme for mortality reasons, which we've discussed, as well as participants who are assessed as no longer meeting eligibility for the scheme via our eligibility reassessment process, but there is no specific assumption about existing participants transitioning over to foundational supports. The allowance is more that people who would otherwise have entered the scheme would transition to foundational.
No, I understand that, but can you just take that back, perhaps go back to my original question in terms of, can you just be a bit more specific about the modelling that you have done in terms of the people who are coming off for foundational supports? So what are your financial modelling around that? So I think what you said is that by 26-27 you are assuming that people will come off in 26-27 and go into foundational supports that states and territories haven't yet signed up for. Is that correct?
No, I think you're conflating two different points, Senator. One goes to the number of people who are being diverted from the scheme onto foundational supports versus the work that we do every single day, as you know, around eligibility reassessment, particularly for people that come onto the scheme for early supports. As you know, it's critical that we work with those participants to understand where they are at various kind of age or assessment points. And Mr McNaughton might want to speak about that process, but they're two very, very different points on the number.
No, I understand that, but coming back to what you said at the beginning, is that there's about 140,000 plus coming off over the coming off the scheme.
Not coming off, being diverted from the scheme to foundational supports. That's why they're two very distinct points.
Yes, no, I understand that. So you've got 140 people over the next 4 years coming off the scheme.
No, Senator, they're being diverted from the scheme. They're very different concepts.
Okay. Tomato, they're actually coming off the NDIS and the plan is that they will go into something different, supports that are funded by the states and territories of foundational supports. Or you now...
Sorry, Senator, just to be really clear, there is no assumption that's made in this report of participants being diverted from the scheme to foundational supports. There is an assumption about future participants who otherwise might have entered the scheme going to foundational supports, but there's no assumption around people being diverted from the scheme to foundations.
But I wrote it down, and you said at the beginning of those 100 and I thought it was 150, you said 140 people who are coming off the scheme, which was table 5.2. So those people.
I apologise. We might just need to clarify the sort of. But yeah, if that's how it came across. Sorry, that wasn't.
No. Okay, so let's just go back to table 5.2. We can all agree, I think, from based on what you've said, that in that table it shows that 140 something people over the forward between this year and the end of 2028. 140-odd thousand people who are currently on the scheme will no longer be on the scheme. A percentage of those will have passed away, and most of the others, you said, will be people who will, this is what Ms Falkingham said, is that most of those people will be coming off the scheme because they're going into foundational supports.
No, I did not say that, Senator. I was very clear. This is people that who might normally have sought access to the scheme, getting the right foundational supports, either through the targeted or general foundational supports that the NDIS review recommends.
So Senator, after this question, I'll rotate the call.
So can I just ask then, so those 140,000 people who you've budgeted to come off the scheme over the forward estimates, there will be some people who have passed away, but there will be others who come off the scheme. They will no longer be existing clients.
Yeah, I think just to be, it's about 80,000 over the forward estimate, Senator, and yeah, of those, there's a proportion of them will be disabled, be deceased, and a proportion of them will, their eligibility will be, they'll be assessed as no longer eligible for the scheme, and so it's those. There's those two different groups, but yeah, of existing scheme participants, there's no assumption of participants coming off the scheme and transitioning to foundational supports.
Okay, but you will have deemed them not to be eligible for the scheme anymore.
Well, we make an assumption.
Not anymore. Can I be really clear? It's not anymore. It's people who would have tested their access to the scheme, getting really appropriate, localised, targeted and foundational support. So it's not, as I said, there's two different concepts, Senator.
Okay. I will come back just pending whether Senator Steele-John joins us, because the Greens did call this bill over as well. But Senator Pratt, you've got the call now, and then returning to the opposition.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to start with some questions, please, in relation to the work of the Fraud Fusion Task Force. I'll just give a moment for the right officer to come to the table and ask about the numbers of what's happening and how many investigations and how many participants are impacted.
Thanks for your question, Senator. So I might pass to my colleagues, but as you know, there is a continued focus on protecting participants and safeguarding the NDIS, so it remains available to support Australians with disability when they need it. The NDIA leverages the capability of the Fraud Fusion Task Force to identify, prevent and disrupt fraud against government programs, including the NDIS. This includes intelligence sharing, prosecution and other regulatory actions. In the October 2022-23 budget, the government announced $137.7 million in initial funding over 4 years to establish the Fraud Fusion Task Force, including $11.1 million to continue task force integrity until it rolled into the Fraud Fusion Task Force in July last year. An additional $15.1 million was received by Services Australia to continue the Fraud Fusion Task Force over 2 years until 2025-2026. As of the 30th of September, there are 97 active fraud operations being led by the NDIA and the NDIS Commission and Services Australia. We have 519 active investigations, including 50 people being referred to the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions or before the courts. We have over 11,000 individuals that we're ensuring continuity of supports for. Got almost 62 million in estimated fraud. So this is a really important part of our agency, and we're really grateful to all those other agencies who work on the Fraud Fusion Task Force. And again, kind of a huge credit to our team in the NDIA who work tirelessly around the clock to ensure that every dollar of this scheme goes to participants and not nefarious actors in the market. So we're really pleased that this work is continuing with additional investment recently announced by Minister Shorten.
Well done, and thank you for that. Can I ask, of the 500 and you said there are 519 participants that you've been able to identify that have been impacted thus far. Is that, if that's the entirety of the cohort affected by the 50 people before the courts or the 97 investigations?
No, so there's 519 active investigations, and that includes 50 people who have been referred. We have over 11,000 individuals that have been
11,000
government services. That's not just ourselves, though. We should point out that covers all the entities within the Fraud Fusion Task Force, and I think we've gone through them before. But you know. That includes everyone from National Quality Safeguards Commission, the Department of Social Services, Department of Veterans Affairs, so everyone who's been involved in that Fraud Fusion Task Force. There's different activities underway as part of that work.
Can you give us an estimate of how much money we're talking about in the context of NDIS funding that has been found to have been, I guess, fraudulently billed?
So through the Fraud Fusion Task Force, there's over 62 million estimated in fraud value, but obviously there's a lot of work that is currently still underway, and obviously we have our line where people can tip us off to fraudulent activities as well, but that is our current number.
So in the context of people missing out on services that they may have needed, or what kind of fraud have you seen happen? Is it people not receiving services that they've billed the NDIS for? And I guess, what does it say if these companies are, for example, still providing services? It does call into question the quality and ethics of the services that are being delivered that might not have been part of a fraudulent activity but are associated with those same entities. What kinds of issues arise for participants when their provider is committing fraud?
Thanks, Senator. It's a great question, and obviously we see everything from fraudulent activity in relation to access to the scheme all the way through to kind of providers kind of colluding in relation to expenditure on participants' plan. And I should point out that meeting with a lot of providers in my job, as I do every single day, on the most part, they are all extraordinary and do fantastic things and are deeply committed to the best possible participant outcomes. And there's obviously a code of conduct that everyone signs up to, but I know, speaking to them, that they're as frustrated as we are, that the terrible kind of flow-on impacts it has to the provider market overall. But we have a dedicated team that's known as our CERT team that exists in the agency that really do extraordinary work to wrap around and support a participant the minute we're aware of that kind of fraudulent activity. So I might ask our Deputy CEO, Scott McNaughton, through that work.
Thank you, Ms. Falcon. I'm Scott McNaughton speaking, Senator. I think first and foremost, with any scheme integrity or fraud matter, we're investigating the participant welfare and risk lens is number one. And if we get any evidence to suggest that the participant is at risk, not getting the key services or supports that they need, we have a scheme integrity response team. So there's some of our most well-trained planners who will work very quickly, very swiftly to connect those participants to more reputable and registered service providers so they can get their critical care needs met through their support. So first and foremost, it's always from a participant welfare and risk lens from our perspective. So we will then take all the other legal and investigation procedures that need to be taken with the said providers. But we have a team dedicated just making sure participant risk is managed, and we think that's the number one lens we want to come to. Of course, we want to see every dollar going to where it should be, and there are some very unscrupulous providers out there who are plans and things. But first and foremost, we want to make sure that the participants are supported, and if need be, we will move them very, very quickly from those providers to other providers so that they can continue to access the supports they need.
And so in that context, what kind of protective factors are around for participants, both through the NDIS, but also in terms of families or people noticing that something's not quite right? You know, how do you audit and make sure, for example, that someone who might have a decision-making disability or other vulnerability and isn't being complicit with being ripped off? And also, how do you, I guess if you find a case of fraud in a particular provider, how do you then go, and that might come, you might get notified through family or something's not quite right. Are these providers particularly marketing or targeting more vulnerable people with disability, and how do we make sure those protective factors are around them so that you can uncover all of this conduct and get people connected to the services they need?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I might get my colleague, Ms McKenzie, to talk to our participant safeguarding policy and practice we have in place, and we have a very detailed risk matrix that we work with. As Ms Walkingham said, it's really important we work across the government agencies. The National Disability Quality and Safeguards Commission, they can do a lot of from a provider lens. One of the things at a very practical level we might do, if we can see a participant who may be vulnerable, who is being taken advantage of, we will link them up to a reputable support coordinator or plan manager agency that we can connect them to, who can then help them with their decision making and connect to better providers. So that's a very quick intervention that we can and do put in place quite often in these circumstances.
Have you seen institutional things that would say, right, there are people with no family who've got decision-making disabilities who are tied up to a for-profit and don't have other institutional supports around them that would call out whether something is wrong? Are you able to, how do you, in your risk matrix, make sure that that their circumstances are being looked after, and that you find people who might be subject to that kind of fraud?
Yes, and those are exactly the questions we ask as part of our risk assessment.
Yeah, great.
Susceptible to fraud, harm? Do they have any or good informal supports around them? Are they capable of making those decisions on their own, or do they need some assistance? And then the answers to those questions then determine our response. When funding in the plan, we need to connect them through guardianships or other support services. But then I might get Ms McKenzie to talk to our participant safeguarding policy. There's been a lot of work with the sector done on that.
Thank you. I'd be pleased to hear from Ms McKenzie.
Thank you, Senator. I'm Corrie McKenzie, Deputy CEO for Service Design and Improvement. The agency released last year a participant safeguarding policy, We developed working in co-design with disability representative organisations and with participants and members of our independent advisory council. And that policy really spoke to building on the work that we have in place already through the risk matrix that Mr McNaughton has talked to, and the kind of responses that all of our workforce use, and that's right across the areas which engage with participants. So from the service delivery teams working with Mr McNaughton, but also, for example, to our National Contact Centre. So the risk matrix applies through our systems and across all of those workforces. We're really concerned through the implementation of the participant safeguarding policy to really build on that work that's a really important foundation, to really strengthen our understanding, particularly of the evidence around risk factors that might indicate that a participant might need more support to really build out, for example, natural safeguards to confirm safety in a more acute circumstance. So, and really what the best evidence-based levers and supports that we might be able to put in place to not only address any immediate safety risk or concern for a participant, but also really to work with them to build natural safeguards and supports over a period of time so that they're really well supported both in their decision making and in their personal circumstances as well. Obviously, the Disability Royal Commission and the NDIS review both had really strong recommendations about the approach that government systems, and particularly the NDIS, can and should take, and both really called out the safeguarding policy. And so that's a really significant piece of work in our reform program of work, which is really, as I said, about really building out that information to understand what information do we already have about participants that's really relevant, understanding their risk and safety, but also how can we most effectively support and enable them to be in safe circumstances, but also to work to build, as I said, particularly with a focus on natural safeguards, so that they're connected to communities, connected to really good supports, supported in their decision making where that's relevant as well. So it is a really significant program of work, but as Mr McNaughton said, something that is just fundamental to the work that we do. And while we have a whole range of efforts and activities in place, we think this is something that we can and should really continue to invest in. And there's no point at which we can be good enough in this area. So it's something that we're, as I say, is a really dedicated focus of work.
Are there particular business models that, I guess all business models can have particular advantages for participants, but some can leave participants might also leave them more intrinsically vulnerable? Or, where do you see these problems arising? Are they small providers? Are they small independent one-on-one providers? Are they independent contractors? Are they big platforms? Are they charities? Or is it fairly spread out?
I think, Senator, I might jump in there, and I know Mr McNaughton can also speak to this. I think what we really see, and certainly what the evidence supports, is that it is usually a combination of risk factors. It's not a single red flag, if you will. There are small providers and independent contractors who provide extraordinary support to participants, and there are participants who live in a whole range of particular settings, both who are extremely well connected to communities and extremely well supported and safe in their environments, with lots of strong natural safeguards, and people who live in all sorts of different settings, for example, for whom have many more risk factors and who don't have those connections. So it is really hard to kind of pinpoint a particular setting or a particular kind of nature or provider, or indeed a particular kind of attribute of a participant, for example. But there is very strong evidence. a lot of work was done by the Royal Commission itself, for example, in terms of really understanding the evidence base around risk factors for people with disability, and I think understanding those risk factors, but most importantly by being able to work with the participant to understand their experience, their confidence and comfort in their environment is a really important part of any understanding of risk, safety and wellbeing, but also kind of strengths and connections into community. So, as I said, the safeguarding policy really talks to that. The other piece of work that I think is really relevant in this circumstance is also supported decision making and supported decision making policy, and certainly where really good supported decision making practices have been implemented within providers and supporters around people with disability, that's a really important and powerful natural safeguard. And so I think the two are relevant and connected.
Yeah.
And certainly where we see really strong practices around supports for decision making, that we also frequently see really good natural safeguards in place as well, and that's really important because, of course, a person with disability who might have some decision support needs also has a really strong voice in that, which is one of the most critical natural safeguard too.
And can I'm not sure how much more time I've got, Chair.
I'm due to rotate the call now. So
I'm happy to leave it there then. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Senator Pratt. Just before I pass the call back to Senator Reynolds, I just wanted to check if Senator Steele-John's on the line, to give him the opportunity, given the Greens called the NDIA for this spillover as well. No? Okay. Senator Reynolds, and you've got the call. Pending, I don't believe anyone else online is seeking the call. If you are, please let me know. But if not, you've got the call up to we're due to move to Services Australia at 1:45.
Thank you very much, Chair. Could I just continue on from Senator Pratt's questioning, if I could, in relation to the Fraud Fusion Task Force? How many investigations were commenced last financial year, and how many have commenced this financial year?
Senator, I'm happy to get you the breakdown on notice.
Sorry, you do have or you don't have it on hand?
I just said I'm happy to get the breakdown between the two financial years for you on notice.
Oh, on notice. Sorry, I missed those. Sorry, missed that. Okay. So could you take on notice then, if you can go back to 2019-20 through to the year to date for this financial year, how many investigations were commenced? How many individuals were charged and or found guilty? And also, do you know this financial year and last financial year, how much money has actually been recovered?
We're happy to take that on notice for you, Senator.
Okay, well, thank you. And if you could also then take on notice for Mr Gifford in terms of what were your assumptions for last financial year and this financial year on the budget impact? Because I recall at previous estimates there was a lot of talk about how it would make a significant impact on the budget and certainly impacted on your assumptions. My recollection was the last figure we got, there was about 12 million last financial year before the end of the financial year had been recovered. Anyway, if you could take all that on notice, if you don't have it there, that would be terrific. Thank you.
Yes, Senator, we'll take the notes.
Thank you. If we could come back to table 5.2, and there appeared to be some, we weren't sort of speaking apples and apples, it appeared. So if we go back to table 5.2, so just to make sure we're talking about the same thing, because this is critically important now to actually understand what's going to be happening with people coming in and out of the scheme over the next 10 years. So as I read it, as per your explanation, we've got 661,267 existing scheme participants, and then as of next year, that will drop to 642,878. And then in 2026, 621,634, then moving through to 2034, where the scheme existing participants, so those who are in the scheme today, will have dropped from 661,267 to 506,271, which means by my calculator, over 10 years, 154,996 people who are on the scheme today will not be on the scheme anymore. Is that a correct interpretation?
Yeah, that's correct, Senator.
Okay. Now, you've taken on notice for me to actually provide in your assumptions how many of those will have come off the scheme because they're deceased, and that number's been running at about 1% of the scheme on average, and you've got it just under that. So that would be about 1% of the total scheme participants, correct?
Correct.
And the rest will be coming off the scheme for other reasons.
That's right.
Okay. So as I understand your previous, in fact, it may have been Ms Falkingham's, that there will be another 90,000 people who won't come on the scheme because they will be diverted from 2026 into other foundational supports.
No, sorry. So I think we didn't refer to the number of participants. We just referred to the fact that foundational supports will be available, or the assumption is that the participants will be receiving foundational supports are those who would otherwise have entered the scheme. So they're in they're sort of it's the future participant row in the table where the assumption is foundational support.
And it's also your assumption then that the 506,271 existing scheme participants who remain will account for 68% of projected budget costs, and the other 515,000 new entrants will account for 32% of future scheme costs. So on average, the 50% of people on the scheme then who are new entrants, as in after this year, will be significantly cheaper than those who are currently on scheme on average.
That's right, Senator. As we said, I mean, it's really, I mean, the comment I would add is, the way we set assumptions around the cost of people entering the scheme is to look at the cost of people who have entered the scheme in recent years and observe that those participants have, sorry, I keep using the term cost, so I kind of prefer to use the term needs, but the people entering the scheme, over recent years do have lower needs than those who have been in the scheme, since its early inception.
Okay, thank you. So to make that clear, could you take on notice, could you provide your breakdown of your assumptions that underpin that 68-32% split so we can understand how many people in 10 years, how many new entrants you've projected will be on SIL, for example, and at that higher end of the packages, and how many, and the age range and the disability range. I know you've got all those projections. So if you could take that so we can see how that will vary over time.
We can definitely do that, Senator. I think it's important. As you know, we're an insurance scheme. None of this is new. People exit the scheme every single year. And
of course they do.
Could be for mortality, entering residential aged care, voluntary exits, reassessments. So I want to make sure that it's very clear we've not changed any aspect of eligibility in the scheme, but we're really happy to provide you that breakdown.
Thank you. So, Ms Falkenham, there's no judgment on my behalf. I'm just asking for the data that underpins these assumptions. And some of it used to be in the old quarterly reports, and some of that information has now been reduced over the last couple of years. So it's not, of course, people do come in and out, and this is what we're talking about, but we're actually just looking for the data. How many in historical basis have been, what age groups and what age ranges, etc. We know the mortality rate that you've assumed, so that's fine. But to get that split, what assumptions are you making based on your best guess with the data that we have available today, so we can see what underpins that information?
as I said, Senator, really happy to get you the data, but often it's my job to make sure that kind of anyone who's watching kind of, doesn't think that there are changes that have been made to the scheme that we haven't.
No, I understand that, and this is a budget estimates, and we are looking to see, and obviously in this case as an insurance scheme, the actuarial assumptions are critically important. And in the last couple of AFSRs, there hasn't been quite as much information in terms of how those assumptions were made. So that is what I'm seeking. It's not judgment, it's actually just seeking the data and particularly how some of these assumptions were made.
Yes, Senator, I just would add, I think certainly Section 5, you've touched on a couple of them, do go through the assumptions, that do underpin these projections, but look, very happy to take a specific question about the the participants who make up the 68% and the 32%. Certainly very happy to take that.
Well, as I got a 218-page document a couple of hours ago, Mr Gifford, as I pointed out, we haven't had a chance to read every single word yet. So if you can point us in the right direction and give us the actual numbers, I think that would be, it would be incredibly helpful. Now, can we also now go to the reassessment numbers? Now, in a couple of places, there's been discussions about reassessments and reassessment requests because of plan inflation, which we've discussed previously. Now, there was also somewhere, and I haven't, my apologies, but you'll remember what it is. There's the reason for increasing numbers of leavers recently is that you're now clearing a larger number of backlog requests, and from memory, it was a processing issue about getting enough staff because of the volume of requests that you have had, which unfortunately means that the PSG has fallen significantly behind. But if you could perhaps on notice first go back to 2019-20 and the number of reassessments that you've had year by year through to now. So the total number of reassessment requests you've had, but also those that the NDIA has initiated yourself for very good reasons. And
I just worry we're conflating two issues. And you asking of the, obviously we had a backlog in relation to significant change of circumstance.
Yes.
But eligibility reassessments have been part of the scheme since its inception. We're just really, now that we have investment in the workforce over the last few years, we're actually getting on top of the eligibility reassessment. So can I just be clear which one you're asking about?
Well, both, because there's a number of reasons for reassessment, which, as you said, are long-standing. But I think from the March quarter, you had about 40,000. I can't remember if it was 40,000 you did or it was a backlog of 40,000. But in the last report, that had elevated to nearly 62,000. So that I just wanted you to unpack that for us. Are these reassessments, and if you need to take it on notice, that's fine, but of these quarterly numbers of reassessments, how many were participant initiated for change of circumstances, caused by plan inflation or whatever else, and how many were actually initiated by the NDIA itself?
Very happy to take it on notice, Senator. There's three different categories I think you're referring to, but I understand and we'll take them on notice and come back to you.
Yep, so thank you. So if you could do that, what it is year to date as of now, what it was last year, and then if you can, I know you've got the information available, so if you could perhaps take that back to 2019 so we can get some sort of longitudinal understanding of that. And also if you could, over the last maybe 3 financial years, if you could give me a summary of the 21 and 56-day participant service guarantee, which in terms of processing the different types of assessments, my understanding is the 21-day PSG has only been met at 30% of claims, and the 56-day is down to 59%. That might not be quite right, but that was my first look. So if you could perhaps take that on notice and give us where those metrics have been tracking.
Can do, Senator. Obviously, we've made great inroads in relation to those numbers. So happy to give you the most current ones.
Yeah, no, look, that'd be great. And also, that's why we need the volume and also the processing time, because clearly there'll be a correlation between the volume and your ability to process that many. Now, could you also like to come to the AAT cases and caseload numbers? So I understand as of the September quarter, so in the first quarterly report, there were 1,769 new cases at the AAT, which was an increase of 0.87% from the September 2022 quarter. So could you, have you got any of those figures at hand for the AAT?
We do, Senator. I'll ask Mr Swainson, our Deputy CEO, to take you through that detail.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yes, Matt Swainson, Acting Deputy CEO, Senator. I can provide some further context and information about those figures if you want to let me know what you're interested in.
Yes, please. We've lost you.
There you are, sorry.
Just checking for the question there. I might have missed
wasn't a loss of audio. There we go. Thank you.
Oh.
You're...
Oh, sorry. I thought... Are you waiting?
So I've got those figures in front of me. I'm available to answer questions about it. There might have been a connection problem. I'm just testing if there was a question.
I think there was. I think there was a bit of breakdown on both sides.
Sorry for our IT interaction. If you just give me the question again, Senator, I'll see what I can
So my question is in relation to claims that go through the AAT process. So how many claims now? I think the last one I had was that there were 1,769 new AAT cases in the September quarter, but I'm wondering if you have any more numbers on that, and I'm happy for you to take them on notice. So what I'd like to know is how many claims there have been year to date, how many were resolved before the matter actually went before the AAT, and how many are currently going through the AAT. And I know you do have the statistics sort of by financial year. Have you got any of those, or do you want to take them on notice?
Some of those numbers I can provide, Senator. So there's a long-standing set of figures where somewhere between 98% and 99% of matters before the Administrative Review Tribunal, it is now, it's reported as the AAT and the
ART, yes.
We're now in the ART. That's correct. It's a bit difficult. So that proportion has remained steady. So we still resolve somewhere between 97 and 99% of cases without going through to hearing.
That's great. Can you then take on notice the actual numbers? So how many? So if we go back to 2019-20, how many claims were filed in total, and then how many of those were settled beforehand, and how many of them were settled actually at the AAT/ART? I'm happy to take that on notice given the time. Could I also ask on notice, Chair, just in relation to what just touched on the PSG briefly, but Ms Falkingham, if I could just ask a couple of specific questions that might help with the putting together the answer. Actually, no, I'll put those on writing. So in relation to the reassessments, so we had in the Q1 report, there were 61,767. Could I ask, so for that number, to make it easier, just for that last quarter, how many of these requests were approved? How many were denied? How many are still pending? And if you could, as I said, explain the impact that those numbers have had on the participant service guarantee, that would be appreciated. Now, also just on that, so as I mentioned, there was an increase from the March quarter to the September quarter from 400,000 plan reassessments to 61,767 reassessments. And if you could provide a split of how many of those were agency initiated and how many were participant initiated, and then what the processing time is to do that. Now, is that okay?
We can take that on notice. I think there's some overlap, but that's all right. We'll take that on notice.
Thank you. Just also, can you provide information for this current financial year and the last financial year in terms of, in fact, maybe take it back to 2 financial years, how many applications you have had received from potential participants, how long that has taken from the time that they've put their application in, how long it has taken to process it and either reject or accept that application, and for those applications that have been accepted, what is the time to actually get a plan approved?
Sorry, Senator, to be clear, you're talking about access requests.
So this is going to access requests now, so not people who are already on the scheme, but access requests. So what is the number over the last 2.5 years, or by year, of how many applications, requests you have had to enter the scheme? And what is the average processing time for those? And then once they have been processed, the second bit of data is how long has it taken participants who have been approved to get their plan? Because I don't know if Senator Steele-John was here, this is a question that he is keenly interested in, is how many people have taken, or how long has it taken people to actually get a plan approved and it underway?
Well, do you want to check if Senator Steele-John is here? I don't believe he is.
Well, it doesn't matter. I'll ask the question.
I'm just checking because, as you mentioned, it's a question of interest to him and it's a spillover.
Senator Steele-John, I hadn't seen him pop up.
We can take that on notice, Senator. Obviously, as you know, there's a lot of different factors that influence kind of a plan's implementation in terms of provider coverage and kind of service coverage, but very happy to take that on notice for you.
So thank you. Just to be clear, the reasons are, I fully understand, the reasons are many and they're complex. So it's not that, it is just a simple request of the metrics. Once somebody has had an application lodged to join the scheme, what is the average time between lodging it and getting a decision? And then those who are eligible for the scheme or have been approved, how long it takes them to get a package. Because anecdotally, what we've heard is that time is expanding, probably for good reasons, but we just want the metrics on the timeframes.
Okay, Senator. Deputy CEO Norton can respond to that now.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. Scott Norton speaking. So you're talking about PSG number 6, which is approve a participant's plan after we've made an access decision. So it's the one that we track for adults. As at October in our current PSG, that was 80.6%. So that's increased, where the timing earlier in the year was a bit lower, it was around 45%. So we've done a lot of work by improving the number of frontline staff trained to do first plans. So that's increased from 45% to 80%. We're very confident of getting that back into what we call PSG green in the next 3 to 6 months. In the Children's Pathway, Senator, it's PSG 7, which is approve an early supports plan after access. That is running at 99.7% of the timeliness standard, Senator. But I can give you all that data and we can break that down for you.
That would be excellent. Thank you for that.
Senator, I've got to do the spiel in about 3 minutes.
Okay, one final question and I'll put the rest on notice as we go through the rest of the document. Actually, maybe I can put some of these on. I can put some of these on notice, actually, Chair.
All right.
I'll put the rest on notice. Thank you.
Easy done. Just a last call for anyone online for questions, the Greens or Senator Hughes. No? Okay. That concludes our session with the NDIA. So I remind senators that the committee has agreed that any written questions on notice should be lodged with the Secretariat by Thursday the 19th of December 2024, and to the agency you have taken a number of questions on notice. We're asking for answers to those to be provided to us by Thursday the 30th of January 2025. But thank you for your participation and Merry Christmas. We'll now be calling Services Australia. We'll just take a brief 1-minute suspension as we change the officials over in the room.